Billionaire destroyed her flower shop. Never knew she saved his mother's life. The morning sun barely touched the cobblestone streets of Charleston, South Carolina, when Margaret opened the doors of Bloom and Grace. Her small but beloved flower shop tucked between a bakery and a dry cleaner on Magnolia Street. She had owned this shop for 11 years. 11 years of early mornings, calloused hands, and flower-stained aprons. 11 years of learning which roses lasted longest, which lilies smelled strongest, and which customers needed more than just flowers. They needed someone to listen. Margaret was that someone. At 53, she was sharp, warm, and quietly powerful. She had built Bloom and Grace from nothing, literally nothing. After her husband passed away and left her with 2 teenagers and a pile of debt, she took her last $800, rented a tiny corner space, and started selling handmade bouquets. Word spread fast. People didn't just come for the flowers, they came for her. She remembered every customer's name, every anniversary, every loss. But today would be different. Today, a man in a blue suit would walk through her door, and nothing would ever be the same again. The man in the blue suit, his name was Richard Calloway. If you lived in Charleston, you knew the name. If you lived anywhere on the East Coast and followed business news, you definitely knew the name. Richard Calloway was 58, a self-made billionaire who had turned a small real estate firm into a multi-billion-dollar empire. He was known for 2 things: his ruthless efficiency and his complete intolerance for what he called wasted potential. To Richard, small businesses on prime real estate were wasted potential. He had been eyeing Magnolia Street for 2 years. The location was perfect, right between the historic district and the new waterfront development his company was building. If he could acquire those 3 blocks, he could build the most premium commercial complex Charleston had ever seen. He had already bought out the bakery. The dry cleaner had signed last week. Only one holdout remained: Bloom and Grace. Richard had sent 3 letters, 2 representatives, one very generous offer, $200,000 for a property worth maybe $80,000 on a good day. Margaret had turned down every single one, so Richard decided to handle it himself. The confrontation, the bell above the door chimed softly when Richard walked in. Margaret was behind the counter arranging a mixed bouquet of garden roses and eucalyptus for a wedding order. She didn't look up immediately. "I'll be right with you," she said warmly. "Take your time," Richard said, his tone already carrying the edge of someone who never actually meant those words. When she finally looked up, she recognized him immediately. Charleston wasn't that big. "Mr. Calloway," she said, her voice steady, "what can I do for you?" He placed both hands on her wooden counter, right on top of the craft paper she used for wrapping, and leaned forward slightly. "You can do what every other business owner on this block had the sense to do," he said. "Sell." Margaret set down her scissors, carefully, deliberately. "I've already given your people my answer," she said. "Your answer was wrong." A few customers near the back of the shop glanced over. A young man who worked part-time for Margaret, barely 19, shifted uncomfortably near the floral display. "Mr. Calloway," Margaret said, keeping her voice calm, "this shop has been here for 11 years. I serve this community. I'm not going anywhere." Richard straightened up, his jaw tightened. "Don't talk back to me," he said quietly, "but loud enough for everyone in the shop to hear. I've made you a more than fair offer. This building is going to be acquired one way or another. The city council has already approved my development plan. You're holding up progress." "Progress for who?" Margaret asked. He stared at her. Nobody talked to Richard Calloway like that. "I'll give you until Friday," he said. "After that, I start using every legal tool available to me. And trust me," he glanced around the shop slowly, almost dismissively. "You don't want that." He turned and walked out. The bell above the door chimed again, but this time it felt like a warning. The campaign Richard was a man of his word, unfortunately. By Monday, his legal team had filed 3 separate complaints with the city: a zoning dispute, a parking ordinance violation, and a noise complaint. None of them were serious. All of them were expensive to fight. By Wednesday, a local blog, one that Margaret had always suspected was, "She saved me," Eleanor said simply, "and you are trying to destroy her." The returned Richard Calloway walked into Bloom and Grace the following Monday morning. No lawyers, no assistants, no blue suit. He wore a simple gray jacket. He looked, for perhaps the first time in a very long time, like a man who wasn't entirely sure of himself. Margaret was at the counter. When she saw him, her expression didn't change much. She had already steeled herself. She assumed this was the final conversation. "I'm not selling," she said before he could speak. "I know," he said. She paused. He looked around the shop. This time not dismissively but slowly, taking it in, the handwritten tags on the flowers, the photos of weddings and graduations on the small corkboard behind the register, the worn wooden counter, the smell of roses and earth and something that was hard to name but felt like home. "My mother told me what you did," he said. 14 months ago, on the bridge." Margaret's expression shifted. Something moved across her face, recognition, then something more careful. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said quietly. "An older woman, camel coat, November. You stayed with her for over an hour." Margaret was still for a moment. "How is she finally asked. Richard's jaw worked for a moment. "She's okay. She's doing better." He paused. "Because of you." The shop was very quiet. Outside, Magnolia Street was waking up. A delivery truck rumbled past. Someone laughed on the sidewalk. "I'm withdrawing all the legal filings," Richard said. "Effective today, and I want to—" He stopped, started again. "There's no amount of money I can offer you that covers what you did. But I'd like to try to make this right, if you'll let me." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. "I don't need your money, Mr. Calloway," she said. "I know," he said, "but this neighborhood might. What came next, the development still happened, but differently." Richard redesigned the plan. Bloom and Grace stayed exactly where it was. The new complex was built around it. A deliberate choice that his architects initially fought and eventually came to consider one of the most distinctive design decisions of the project. Richard personally called the wholesale suppliers who had dropped Margaret and made clear that their contracts with Calloway Enterprises depended on their reinstatement of hers. The legal fees Margaret had already incurred were quietly covered by a Calloway Foundation grant for small minority-owned businesses. No fanfare, no press release. Eleanor Calloway began coming into Bloom and Grace every Saturday morning. She and Margaret would drink coffee and talk while Margaret arranged the week's fresh stock. Eleanor started volunteering at a grief support group, something Margaret had gently suggested. Richard came by once, about 6 weeks later, to pick up flowers for his daughter's birthday. He waited in line like everyone else. When he reached the counter, Margaret handed him a small bouquet of white gardenias, his daughter's favorite, though he had never mentioned it. Somehow Margaret had remembered from a conversation months ago that he didn't even recall having. "How did you—" he started. "I pay attention," she said simply. He looked at her for a moment. "I know that," he said quietly. "I know." What the flowers knew, there's a version of this story where Richard Calloway succeeds, where Margaret takes the money or loses the legal fight and Bloom and Grace becomes a parking structure or a luxury retail space that sells things no one in that neighborhood can afford. It almost happened that way. But sometimes the thing standing between someone and their worst decision is a single moment of being truly seen. The way Margaret had seen Eleanor on that bridge, not as an inconvenience or a liability, but as a human being in pain who deserved someone to simply stay. Eleanor once said, in the grief group she now helps facilitate, that the most important thing Margaret did that morning was that she didn't try to fix her. She didn't call for help immediately or create a scene or treat her like a problem. She just talked to her like a neighbor, like someone who mattered. There are people in every city, on every street, and every small shop that the world keeps trying to erase. People who are doing the quiet, unglamorous, essential work of making the humans around them feel less alone. Was one of them. She still is. And every Saturday morning, when Eleanor Calloway walks through the door of Bloom and Grace and the little bell chimes above her head, Margaret looks up from whatever she's arranging and smiles, like she's been expecting her, because she has. Bloom and Grace, still open, Magnolia Street, Charleston, 11 years, and counting,